Have you ever wondered about the true cost of the Vietnam War? This question may seem straightforward, but the answer is far from it. The Vietnam War, a conflict that spanned nearly 2 decades, from 1955 to 1975, stands as one of the longest and most controversial wars in American history. It was a war that transcended borders, a war that saw the world's superpowers drawn into a protracted conflict in the small Southeast Asian nation of Vietnam. But what about the human toll? The scores of lives that were forever altered or extinguished. The war claimed the lives of an estimated 2 million Vietnamese civilians, over 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, and approximately 58,000 American soldiers. Yet these numbers, as staggering as they are, only tell part of the story. We must also consider the countless individuals who bore the scars of war, both physical and psychological, long after the last shots were fired. The veterans who returned home, forever changed by the horrors they had witnessed and endured. The families who lost loved ones, their grief a lasting testament to the cost of conflict. The children born in the aftermath, inheriting a world shaped by the echoes of battle. And then there's the economic toll, which is often overlooked. The war cost the United States more than $168 billion, a figure that equates to over $1 trillion in today's currency when adjusted for inflation. This economic burden had profound implications for American society, contributing to a period of stagflation and economic uncertainty that lasted well into the 1970s. As we delve into this historical event, we take a somber look at the casualties that marked each stage of the conflict. The unseen cost of war is more than just a tally of deaths and dollars spent. It's a legacy of loss, of sacrifice, and of a nation forever changed. It's a stark reminder that the true cost of war is measured not only in lives lost, but also in the lives forever altered by the echoes of conflict. The early years of the Vietnam War, from 1965 to 1967, were marked by escalating violence. This was a period of rapid escalation, as American and Vietnamese forces clashed in a series of battles that would set the tone for the rest of the conflict. One of the earliest and most significant of these battles was the Battle of Ia Drang. Taking place in November 1965, it was the first major engagement between the U.S. Army and the People's Army of Vietnam. This was a brutal fight, marked by close-quarter combat and heavy casualties on both sides. The American forces, led by Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, were dropped into the Ia Drang Valley by helicopter directly into the path of a large North Vietnamese force. Over the course of several days, both sides sustained heavy losses. The Americans reported over 300 casualties, while estimates for North Vietnamese losses run into the thousands. The Battle of Ia Drang was a harsh introduction to the realities of jungle warfare for many American soldiers. It highlighted the resolve of the North Vietnamese army, who were willing to suffer heavy losses in order to inflict damage on U.S. forces. It also demonstrated the difficulties of fighting in unfamiliar terrain, a factor that would continue to plague American forces throughout the war. But Ia Drang was just one of many battles during these early years. From Operation Starlight, the first major offensive by the U.S. Marine Corps, to the Battle of Dong Xuai, these engagements painted a picture of a war that was only getting started. The casualty toll on both sides was staggering. Thousands of American and Vietnamese lives were lost. Each battle, each skirmish, each ambush brought a new wave of death and destruction. And yet the war pushed on, the violence escalating with each passing year. These initial years set the tone for a conflict that would only grow more deadly with time. The early years of the Vietnam War, from 1965 to 1967, were a grim foreshadowing of what was yet to come. The year 1968 marked a turning point in the Vietnam War with the infamous Tet Offensive. This offensive, named after the Vietnamese New Year, was a series of surprise attacks launched by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army against South Vietnam and its allies. It was a bold and audacious move that turned the tide of the war and significantly increased the number of casualties. The Tet Offensive was unlike previous battles. It was a series of coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam, designed to cause maximum disruption and confusion. The scale and intensity of the offensive shocked the world, leading to a massive increase in casualties. In just a few weeks, tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. The U.S. forces alone reported more than 14,000 casualties, with over 3,000 killed in action. The South Vietnamese forces and their allies suffered even greater losses. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army also paid a heavy price, with estimates suggesting they lost between 45,000 to 85,000 fighters. But the Tet Offensive didn't just increase the body count, it also had a profound psychological impact. Despite being a military failure for the North, it exposed the vulnerabilities of the South and its allies, shaking the confidence of the U.S. military and the American public. Images of the offensive flooded the media, bringing the brutal realities of the war into American living rooms. This sparked a wave of anti-war sentiment and widespread protests across the U.S. The Tet Offensive, although a military victory for the U.S. and South Vietnam, was a significant propaganda victory for the North. It highlighted the resilience of the Viet Cong, eroded American public support for the war, and increased pressure on the U.S. government to seek a way out. The Tet Offensive was a tragic period in the war, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties and sparking widespread protests back home. It was a stark reminder of the human cost of war and marked a significant shift in the trajectory of the Vietnam War. As the war dragged on into the 1970s, the casualties continued to mount. The later stages of the Vietnam War were marked by a series of significant events and operations. Among them, Operation Linebacker stands out as one of the most intense bombing campaigns of the entire conflict. Launched in 1972, Operation Linebacker was a concerted effort by the U.S. to cut off supply routes to the enemy and bring North Vietnam to the negotiation table. However, the operation resulted in thousands of lives lost, both military and civilian, and the destruction of significant infrastructure. The human cost of this operation was immense, adding to the mounting casualty count of this prolonged war. In the midst of this, diplomatic efforts were underway to bring an end to the conflict. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, were intended to establish peace in Vietnam and end direct U.S. involvement in the war. However, the agreement failed to achieve its primary goal. Fighting continued between North and South Vietnam, leading to further casualties on both sides. Despite the accords and the subsequent withdrawal of U.S. troops, the war did not end until April 1975, when Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to North Vietnamese forces. This marked the official end of the Vietnam War, but not before it claimed the lives of an estimated 2 million civilians and 1.3 million military personnel. The war's final years were a tumultuous period characterized by intense combat, failed peace agreements, and the continued loss of life. The casualty count kept rising, reaching into the millions, a brutal testament to the human cost of conflict. Each life lost represented a family shattered, a potential unfulfilled, and a nation scarred by the horrors of war. And so, the Vietnam War, a conflict that spanned over a decade, left a legacy of immense human loss and suffering. The final years of the Vietnam War were a brutal testament to the human cost of conflict, with the casualty count reaching into the millions. The end of the war did not mean the end of suffering for the people of Vietnam. The bitter taste of the conflict lingered long after the final shots were fired, leaving an indelible mark on the nation and its people. The aftermath was a panorama of devastation. Cities and towns, once bustling with life, were reduced to rubble. The verdant fields and forests carried the scars of war, while the faces of the people mirrored the pain and the loss. The war had ended, but for the people of Vietnam, a different battle was just beginning. Unexploded ordnance, remnants of a conflict past, continued to haunt the landscape. These deadly artifacts of war, hidden beneath the soil, waited with deadly patience for the innocent and the unsuspecting. Even today, these relics claim lives and limbs, a grim reminder of the war's enduring legacy. And then there was Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant used extensively during the war. Its effects were insidious, creeping into the lives of the Vietnamese people long after the war had ended. Exposure to Agent Orange led to a range of health issues, from cancer and heart disease to severe birth defects. The shadow of this chemical weapon continues to loom over Vietnam, affecting generations unborn at the time of the war. The war also left a deep psychological impact, with veterans and civilians alike grappling with the mental and emotional fallout. The echoes of gunfire and the memories of fallen comrades continue to reverberate in the minds of those who lived through the war, their lives forever marked by the conflict. The aftermath of the Vietnam War is a stark testament to the lasting and far-reaching impact of conflict. It serves as a poignant reminder that the true cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield, into the lives of those left behind, and persists long after the guns have fallen silent. The Vietnam War and its horrific toll on human life serve as a stark reminder of the true cost of conflict.